All right. Excellent. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining me today. I am a product manager at OneInc. As Kyle mentioned, we do insurance payments, basically. We're digital payments for the insurance industry. I'm also a Las Vegas local. There's a handful of us here. Yeah, it's been really awesome to make some connections with people. It's a small but growing tech community here in Vegas, so I'm really happy to meet those of you that are here and also all the people who are not. One of the things that I love about product is that it attracts people from such a diversity of backgrounds and fields. There's all different types of career paths that people take to get here. And I've known people, for example, who followed a kind of a direct path. I think John mentioned, the classic example of someone who's a developer who then gets into product management because they want to be more on the decision-making side. But there are also people I know who came from fields as diverse as journalism, as acting, and the arts. And in my case, I came from a background in language learning, and I started my career abroad. So it's had a huge impact on how I approach life, how I approach product, and that's what I want to share with you guys today. So these are the 3 points that I want to make today, and if I do a good job, then they'll kind of flow from 1 to 2 to 3. First is that common language learning strategies are really not that great. Formal courses and textbooks fall short a lot. I've experienced this myself. I failed very poorly at the task of learning Spanish, and I'm going to share that part of my journey with you. And then I learned some new strategies, and I was able to do much better with my journey with Japanese. Point number 2 might be the hardest point to convince you of, but I think product is very similar to language learning in some key ways. Specifically the part of product where we are in a very complex field that's always evolving. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then number 3 is that this is really the thesis of my talk, and it's that language learning strategies applied to product management can lead to some really effective and fast, efficient learning that enables us to deliver more value and do our job better. So that's where I'm tracking. I want to really emphasize the Q&A part of this one because this is an idea that has kind of been rattling around in my head for a long time. I've talked to people one-on-one with it, but I've never actually presented this idea to an audience of product managers. So I'm really inviting your pushback. Please try and poke holes in the case that I'm trying to make here, and hopefully we can have a fruitful discussion after. Okay, so let's get to it. What I want to do is contrast the commonplace approach, this is like my approach with Spanish, and show you what I think is a much better approach to learning languages, and then we'll talk about all the connections to product. If we flash back in time, about 2 decades ago at this point, I was in Spain, I was studying abroad, I was super excited. I was pretty convinced that I was already fluent, to be honest. We're also going to talk about humility and self-awareness and how that's an important product management skill. I was very much missing that at the age of 20, having a great time in Spain. I had been studying Spanish since junior high. I had crushed the textbooks, I got good grades, I studied hard, I went junior high through high school, I studied it in college, at the college level, and then I found myself studying abroad. And it was only after returning from Spain and doing a more self-aware assessment of where I actually stood that I realized I may be able to actually speak. I could manufacture sentences, right? I could speak to people, but the language that I was creating was not natural. It didn't really sound the way native speakers expected me to sound as a fluent speaker. And when I was consuming Spanish language in the form of media, right, books, radio, actual live conversations, I really struggled. So I never actually attained the level of fluency that I wanted. And I think it's because I was following this commonplace approach. So let me explain these icons a little bit. The commonplace approach, and a lot of you will probably be familiar with this if you've ever taken a class at school on learning languages, is we're going to give you a bunch of tools. That's the top left. We're going to give you some vocabulary. We're going to give you some new grammatical structures. We're going to explain it to you in your native language so you can kind of understand the nuts and bolts of how the target language works. And then in the second step, you create this little factory in your brain. You use those tools and you construct sentences. Fill in the blank in this sentence with the correct word. Construct some sentences using the tools that you were just given. And you get this kind of assembly line going where you're constantly expanding the tools that are at your disposal. You're getting more inputs in the form of words and phrases. And the idea is you kind of try and optimize this as much as possible, and you do a ton of repetition, and through enough repetition of using those tools in the assembly line in your brain, you reach a tipping point, and boom, you're fluent. You've got like your factory line, your assembly lines have expanded to the point that you just do language well in your target language. There's a couple problems with this though. One of them is that it's very divorced from context. A lot of this learning is happening in a kind of a canned simulation kind of environment where you're not actually looking at the way a native speaker would say or write that idea. You're just kind of coming together, you're coming up with it on your own using the tools in your head. The second problem with that is that you end up focusing on the wrong things because of that. Like you're looking at your output constantly, you're trying to optimize the words that are coming out of your mouth, but because it's divorced from that context, you don't actually have a good feedback loop on whether what you're saying is natural or not, and it can lead to a lot of really, really bad habits. And that's where I found myself. I was completely lost at the age of 21, realizing like I didn't know the right way, or at least a way that would be natural to express myself. So, and on that point, I wanted to mention, I think this is probably something that's familiar to you in the field of product management. If you have, for example, taken a formal course of learning about product, right? A lot of these certification courses fall prey to the same pitfalls. And if you've taken a technical course online, for example, there's a lot of good content out there. Don't get me wrong, I love Coursera. There's great content on YouTube. There's a lot of different sources that can be really helpful. But I have very often had the experience of spending a whole day or sometimes multiple days learning something, and then I try to actually apply it at work, and I realize that most of the stuff that I learned in that course is actually not helpful. It's not contextual. It's not really rooted in the day-to-day of my particular company. So that's exactly the kind of negative outcome that we're trying to avoid, that I'm trying to get to with this better approach. Okay, let's look at the right side. The icons probably don't make sense yet. That was intentional. I want to kind of like work through this with you and crunch through the process. When I was 22, I was faced with an opportunity to start over with my language learning journey with Japanese. I moved to Japan, I was teaching English over there, and I was starting from scratch. So I knew I didn't want to repeat the mistakes that I had made learning Spanish. And instead of diving in with textbooks and formal learning and all these courses that I felt had really not helped me as much as I wanted with Spanish, I stepped back and I said, let's learn about learning. Let's look at the different approaches that are out there for learning a language. I talked to people who I thought were doing really, really well in my particular area of Japan and contrasted what they were telling me with the people that I saw struggling. And I saw a lot of people struggling in the exact same ways that I had struggled with Spanish. So it was I had kind of honed my ability to be like, okay, I probably don't want to do that thing, maybe I want to do this thing. Through doing that, I came upon something called the input hypothesis from a linguist named Stephen Krashen. And this is what really changed my life in terms of language learning, but also in terms of learning in general. And I apply this to product and a lot of different aspects of my life. The input hypothesis basically, at a very simple level, says the most important thing for you as a language learner is input. It's contextual, actual language created by native speakers, whether that is spoken or written. And another way of saying it that I really, really like is this sentence. It's a little bit of a long sentence, but stick with me because this is very important. In order to be confident in using a word or phrase, you need to see and understand that word in context 100 times. Now, this is not binary, it's just a heuristic, so you don't get too hung up on the specifics of like the numbers or stuff like that. Like a lot of times, right? You need to, and it works for hearing or seeing, right? This is written, this is just consuming the language in its natural state, whether you're seeing a poster, watching a movie, having a conversation. You need to see a word and understand it in context 100 times before you can confidently use it. So the idea is you need to get to that 100 times as fast as possible. You need to expose yourself to as much of the language in the actual context, not in a textbook where it's completely separate. And through inputting that native-produced natural language, your brain learns to make the connections. This is one of the other things that sets the better approach apart from the commonplace approach, is that our brain really works better this way. Our brains are not designed to be factory assembly lines where we're just kind of cobbling together all of these abstract rules in an ever-expanding network of complexity. Especially with language, it works better when our brain is kind of doing that unconsciously. So what you need to do is train yourself and continually optimize for the effortless feeling of just knowing the way a native speaker would say that kind of thought. So to break it down, with enough comprehensible input of real language, you'll intuitively know how to speak. And this is really where it came together for me, because I was like, okay, this is what happened to me in Spanish. I had all this garbage in my head, and I didn't know what was right and what was wrong. All these rules were super confusing. When your default is to just go to the way a native speaker would use it, because that's the majority of the time you spend with the language, you don't have any bad patterns in your head. You don't have any of those weird mistakes and strange ways of saying things. So with enough comprehensible input of real language, you'll intuitively know how to speak. That's basically the input hypothesis, and this is what I think we can apply to product management. So let's talk about that. I'm just gonna do a quick time check because the timer isn't moving here. Okay. So let's apply this to product management. Number one, expand your comprehensible input. I've glazed over a lot of the details about language learning because I could geek out on that for way longer than I have here, and I want to actually talk about product. So if you want to talk about language learning specifically, let's do that afterwards. But number one, expand your comprehensible input. This is really the key for me. What does that mean? Now, in the context of language learning, it's actually relatively easy because you've got all kinds of resources out there that are already graded for you. You can go to an actual library with books for elementary students, for example, and you can start at kindergarten. And I guarantee you, if you take this approach and you bring like another learner along with you, there are a lot of intermediate and advanced level learners, at least in terms of coursework, and you hand them a book that's for a first grader, like a 6-year-old, and they will not be able to understand it. That's exactly how I felt with Spanish when I started trying to compare this approach, and I was like, oh my God, I can't. This is for a 7-year-old, and I don't know. And it's not just because you don't know how to say elephant or something like that. It's because you don't actually understand the grammar that children regularly use, and that's super, super important. So anyway, you can grade yourself using that type of approach with languages. With product, what it looks like, in my opinion, is really diving into the native content in your organization. When you join a new company, or if you switch to a new industry, or if you, like I did a couple years ago, start doing product management in the tech space for the first time, you're gonna be faced with a whole world of context. And it's just like going to a foreign country and trying to absorb the language. There are acronyms that you won't understand, there's all kinds of jargon, and you have this living network that's probably in Jira or Confluence or whatever software you are using for ticket management, for specs and write-ups and all of that stuff. My advice is to dive immediately into that because you're gonna understand how your product is actually built. You're gonna understand how people actually communicate at your company. And it's gonna be a little bit overwhelming, we'll get to that, that's number two, but I think it's totally worth the effort, and I've seen people fail when they're very resistant to just dive into that context and try and kind of drink from that fire hose. And they want it to be more explainable. They want it to be in a flow chart, and they want it to be more logical and consistent. In my opinion, it never gets that way. I don't think companies ever reach the point where everyone's following the SDLC, and you can just say, okay, which box are you on this flow chart? Never happens. So it's much better to admit that we're not gonna get there through that approach and just dive into the context. If you've ever heard someone say, oh man, the onboarding is awful here, that's the way it's been at every company that I've ever been to. And I don't think it's because the onboarding is bad, it's because it's not the right forum for communicating the complexity of the work that we do. It's just like formal language learning is not gonna be the best way to actually become fluent. So diving into the resources, that's one suggestion that I have. This also applies to learning specific technical tools. So a couple years ago, I was responsible for an API-based product for the first time. And the way I learned how APIs work was, yes, I did watch an hour-long video on YouTube. I'm not saying don't do any of that. This is really about focus, right? So I kind of learned the basics, and there's calls and stuff like that. And then I just dove into our dev docs. We have documentation. It's not the best, but that's actually a good thing too, because you get to learn how the developers think. You get better at communicating with them about these kinds of things. And I actually made a collection in Postman, got some keys provisioned to me in a test environment, and started just using it. And I got all kinds of crazy errors initially, but that's also part of the learning process. This is something that's very good about working in software. You get that immediate feedback, that feedback that I never got as a Spanish speaker. If I said something crazy, to a Spanish person in Spain, as long as they kind of got what I said, they'd be like, oh, yeah. And I have no idea that what I did should have been giving me a massive, like a 400, 500, something like that, right? You get that feedback immediately when you're working with tools in our environment of software. So I would say dive right in. Same thing goes if you're working on a front-end product. If you are, especially if you're new to the industry, if your product has a UI that's on a web page, you should dive immediately into the developer panel. You should go in there, whatever browser you're using, just figure out how to get in there and start looking at how the pieces come together. It might be helpful to take a real brief course on HTML, CSS, JavaScript, stuff like that, so you kind of have a high-level understanding. But taking days to understand that is not going to give you a lot of a leg up on understanding your product and how it actually works. Diving in there with the developer panel, I think will. I've also seen this done with performance monitoring and error tracking. If you're in a kind of an unstable environment, maybe it's like an earlier stage company, and that isn't instrumented very well for people to see it in dashboards and have it just right in front of you as a business user. Dive into Kibana, dive into Sentry, just figure out how that is plugged in to your system or whatever, because there's got to be something out there, right? You're able to see the errors as long as you know where to look, and that will rapidly advance your understanding of those things. So let's address number 2, because the immediate objection to everything that I'm saying is usually, but that's just way too hard. There's so much. How could you possibly be expected to parse all of the complexity by just diving into a company's Jira or something like that? And here, the science of learning has something to say. There's a great book called Make It Stick by an author named Peter Brown and a couple of academic people that he collaborated with. Make It Stick talks about a lot of different ideas for effective learning, but one of them is called effortfulness. I think that's a new word, but learning is most successful when it's effortful. And this also triggered a real change in my approach to learning in general, because we definitely want things to be effortless, right? It feels a lot better when we get 100% on the test or when we get an A on the course, when it just feels natural. And that impulse that we have as humans to want our coursework to feel natural and smooth is very much at odds with how our brains work, because our brains work best when they're struggling to make the connections. It's almost like training for athletics or physical activity, right? You need to strain your body, you need to strain your muscles to make them grow the most. So one mindset change that's really important is just to optimize for it feeling difficult. If you're in an environment where you need to be learning and there's a lot of new stuff that you need to grapple with, it should never feel easy as you're acquiring that, and that should be a warning sign. It's wait, no, I need to be pushing myself a little bit more. I need to be expanding my boundaries. I need to be reaching a little bit more for those concepts that I don't understand yet, because that is precisely how we retain information the most, and it allows us to do what we need to do as product people, which is making all of these connections across the disciplines and across the departments in our company and seeing how everything kind of connects. So dive into the difficult is a very important mindset. And finally, stay humble. This is the soft skills part of it that enables all of the rest. When I was 20 years old in Spain, I was the opposite. I was the counter example of this, because I was so focused on just saying yeah, I'm killing it, I'm awesome, I'm living in Spain, I'm fluent, yeah. I was very, very happy with myself. And it prevented me, it was like wearing blinders. I couldn't see all of the things that I didn't know. I wasn't interested in focusing on the things that I didn't know. I wasn't interested in honest feedback. I actually had a specific example where I was optimizing for speed because I thought that fast talking was the way to sound fluent, right? When you're learning a language, the target language often seems really, really fast. It's not, words per minute, it's generally about the same. There's a little bit of variation from language to language, but it feels really fast because it's overwhelming. So I was okay, I gotta speak fast. And there was this one evening where I was speaking with a Spanish woman in a public square, and she looked at me and she was like, "You speak fast." And I thought it was a compliment. I was like, "Thank you." And she looked at me even weirder. And she was not complimenting me. She was like, "You sound weird, dude." But in my mindset right there, I actually believed that she was complimenting me and kind of endorsing my Spanish fluency. So don't do that, right? We need to constantly look for why we're wrong. We need to be actively soliciting feedback on the things that we're missing, the things that we're not understanding. And the best way to do that is to cultivate a sense of humility and a sense of self-awareness that the people around us can really help us out with and help us grow and become better at our jobs. So I think a lot of this is particularly applicable to people who are relatively new to product or people who are new to a company. But this is also important for leaders, because if you're leading a team, encouraging your team to embrace this mindset, to not get discouraged when it's difficult, to not look for the easy way out, and reinforcing like, no, this is hard. Like, what we're doing is really hard, and that's a good thing. That's a benefit to your ability to become a better product manager. Encouraging them to really dive in, and if they're like, man, this doesn't make sense, like, wait, this one person has said this, and the comments don't connect out on the Jira, that's part of the deal. Like, that's just the way, that's the world we live in, and accepting it and diving into it is going to be really, really effective at growing your team as well. So I've got a few resources here if you want to dive more deeply into the concepts that I shared. The input hypothesis is described really well on this blog. This is the book, Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning. That's been